for that wonderful introduction, McDermott the Hermit. Welcome once again to another fine episode of the Ferris Wheel. I am one of your co-hosts, co-creators, and co-conspirators, Ferris Kennedy. And in the booth to the left of me, a man who was kicked out of the Ramones after their first album because he was just too good looking.
Thank you.
And too clean.
Dr. Ian Clark. Thanks very much.
And in the booth across from us with our producer Armando, a man who goes to bed with a security blanket at night.
Oh. Well, that's because of the Ramon incident.
Yeah. Wait a second, that was my incident.
Your name, sir?
Stephen Wheeler.
There you go. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a very interesting show. It's actually one of our special pieces. So as you may know, in season 2, we did some special pieces on Foo Fighters, The Doors, and R.E.M. And then we always promised you some different kind of pieces. And today we're actually in Wheels' wheelhouse of progressive rock history. So without further ado, because I know absolutely nothing about prog rock, but my main man Wheels does, and the man to the left of me I don't think really cares too much for, but today he's going to pretend.
There's some good stuff there. Right off the top, even when it came out, I thought it was a great term, progressive rock. Other words, yeah, what you're doing there, Elvis, is pretty dated and retro stuff. We're progressive. So keep that in mind as we talk about prog rock today.
Well, they've moved on. They've evolved, right?
Yeah.
We've evolved. The evolution of prog rock. So, Wheels, we have here actually a 45-page essay you wrote on progressive rock here. And it says Volume 1. Okay. So take it away, kind sir.
So basically, you guys have pretty much gone through the entire lingo. So there's progressive rock, prog rock, or simply prog. And it's essentially a way of talking about rock that was born in the United Kingdom around the late 60s. And basically the golden age of it was very short. It's just the first half of the 70s. After that, the anti-disco, pretty much anything, complicated bunch destroyed it, and the 80s became a very, very hard time. But we're going to go chronologically and try to explain where it comes from and where it's been going for the last 40 years. So basically, it's born out of the musical experimentation of the late 60s. Dr. Clark has told us in previous shows about psychedelic music. So prog, to a certain extent, is the natural child of it. So it's basically experimental music with melodies.
Yeah, when it really came in, like, I don't know, around 67, 66, in London, like with the Pink Floyd, as they were called, it was music to take drugs and dance by at after-hours clubs, like the UFO and these type of places. And that's the way it happened. And giving it a kick in the behind was the development of technologies like synthesizers. They weren't really mellotrons, whatever. And together, it was the perfect storm, so to speak. But that's what my little readings tell me, that, Moody Blues, all these guys, you're right, almost kicked in at the same year, like 66, 67. And the Beatles launched it, too.
Mm-hmm.
Lennon had his hippie-trippy stuff going.
With the Strawberry Fields and...
Well, I Am the Walrus is pretty proggy in a way.
Because to me, when I hear prog, and obviously growing up with Wheels, I know this is what he likes. First thing that comes to mind is Floyd, Rush, and then, to my surprise, Supertramp actually got thrown into that category.
Sure. I can see that.
Which is kind of interesting. So, like Wheels went something really detailed here, and I think our listeners are going to be really appreciative of this for sure. Because I myself, when I looked at it, I'm like, okay, wow, this is interesting, because to me, this is like a newfound love. Well, not really love, but it's a newfound. Listen, I find as you get older with music, you tend to learn to appreciate things a little bit more.
I agree with that.
And I've learned to respect Pink Floyd for what they're capable of doing and what they have done.
Exactly.
I've always liked Supertramp just because to me it's Roger Hodgson.
Right.
I don't care about the other guy. As you guys know from our previous shows, right? Davies is his name, I believe. Yeah.
So the early progressive stuff actually is very interesting in the sense that it's a mix. It's some rocks, and there's some blues, there's classical music, there's folk, and then jazz elements. And it's basically, like Dr. Clark told us, it's basically all this mixed in with the influence of hallucinogenics and psychedelic drugs, basically. But what you have to remember is these guys were into different art forms, literature, theater, innovative graphic design. So you have to put yourself into the mindset. So the reason why I said that it was important that it developed in the United Kingdom is that if you've ever looked at the culture in the UK in the 60s, their educational program with music was actually quite advanced compared to other nations.
Oh, yeah.
And so these guys actually had, unlike the Americans, which learned a lot of the music in the bars, a lot of these guys actually learned about it in school. And so they had a huge musical background. And when they heard rock music, they're like, oh, this is perfect. Like, everybody's listening to this. And let's introduce all these other musics to people into our own new rock genre. And like Dr. Clark told us, basically the pioneers are the Moody Blues, Soft Machine, The Nice, the Pink Floyd.
That's right.
And to a great extent, actually, there's a lot of debate if you go on the internet and forums. But most people say that the Beatles are actually the ones that started it all with Strawberry Field Forever because of Mellotron.
Yeah, right.
We can debate that, but frankly, we're not those kinds of people that will debate a point till it dies.
Yeah, who knows? But the idea, I know what they're going with that. I mean, one day they're singing "She Loves You" or "Hard Day's Night," and the next day they're singing "Strawberry Fields." At the time, it was quite mind-blowing, and the influence of psychedelic drugs and the light shows that occurred at these after-hours club cannot be underappreciated. And that comes across in the titles, you know, the Pink Floyd, and the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Like these type of, before that you had stuff like Hippie Hippie Shake or You're 16. Like rock and roll really in 3 or 4 years just did a 180. It was amazing how much it changed.
Well, with Prog, I find though, even the artwork that they have on the albums, like Rush 2112. You know, what the hell is that supposed to be? But whatever, it looks all right. You know, or moving pictures. Well, it's about a bunch of movers. One's follically challenged with a beard, and he's moving this big ass frame.
Well, it used to be the old joke: what 1 million joints have been rolled on the cover of Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, just a lot of dope.
Oh yeah, and actually, a great deal of prog is due to the fact that there's a technology that comes in the late '60s, which is the 33. A long play record.
33 and a third.
Yeah, 33 and a third. Because before that, you have the 45s, which are really short.
Point. Yeah.
Basically, all the Beatles' early catalog is supposed to fit in, 5 minutes? Under 5 minutes?
Yeah, all a pop song back then, like, if you went over 3 minutes, they'd give you a kick.
Yeah.
It was like shy of 3, just a little bit over 2 and change. When I mean change, like
the early
5 to 11 seconds, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's how remember commercial jingles, right?
Exactly.
That was what it was.
So we've talked about Pink Floyd, but actually one of the groups that tends to be forgotten when we talk about prog is the Moody Blues in the 60s with the landmark album Days of Future Past in 67. And that's the first one that actually mixes rock and classical music with a symphony orchestra without it being an effect like on the Beatles albums where it was just something in the background. These guys actually really put a lot of work into it, and they reworked the New World Symphony, which most people now hear as almost a commercial jingle, but back then nobody had ever done this. So it actually is quite interesting. And
Nights in White Satin, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, that whole orchestra thing that came back big in the late 90s with a couple of heavy metal bands, like Metallica was one of them, that they had the S&M orchestra with them.
Exactly, yeah.
So I like that. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Another British band actually in that era is The Nice, which is now more of a footnote. But the reason why it's important is they had a keyboardist called Keith Emerson, which will become a legend in that field. But already in the late 60s, there's a lot of these amazing albums that are starting to fuse rock, classical music, and jazz. So that's where it starts. But really, when we get to the 70s, that's when it gets really interesting. Because that's the 70s that produced some of the most iconic and memorable progressive rock acts of all time. You've probably heard these names if you haven't heard the music. Of course, Pink Floyd, there's Genesis, there's Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, Yes, Gentle Giant. Gentle Giant, though, is a little more European than it is English. There's Van de Graaff Generator, Renaissance, Caravan, Jethro Tull, Gong, Camel. I won't bore you guys with necessarily just a list, but basically those are really the legends of the style. And what's really interesting also is that it inspires a worldwide craze, which you really wouldn't think it would do, because it was, like Dr. Clark told us, it was really culturally narrow to a certain extent. Like, it wasn't like the Americans where it was supposed to be easy consumption. These guys were heavy.
They were heavy, and they played great concerts, because a lot of kids would go to concerts and just get blitzed on dope, whatever. And it was much easier on the brain listening to Pink Floyd than it would be, guys playing 3-minute rock songs. And the other thing that happened, too, in the late 60s, beginning in the States, really, is FM radio, where they would play entire sides of albums late at night, uninterrupted by commercials. That was unheard of. And stuff, because commercials, it used to be, the old joke used to be, songs are what they, played to separate commercials. And really they did on AM radio. With FM, late at night, there was a station of New York City. I forget the name of the station, but they would play, like, most albums are about maximum, 44 minutes, I think. They'd play like 22 minutes and then a commercial. So a lot of guys, and I might have been guilty, would flick on their microphones and record off the speaker. But that's the only way we knew how to do it back then. And that was the first big recordings. You didn't do it for one song. You did it for half of Dark Side of the Moon.
And what's been really interesting is albums like these actually inspired the rest of the world. So with all the names we've mentioned, like, you'll easily find those albums. But what's a little less known is that there were great bands in Italy that came out of this movement. And they actually rivaled the British in creativity and quality. There's Banco del Muteo Soccorso. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right.
I read those ones there. Yeah, I got it right here. That was an interesting title. I was looking at that the other day, and yeah, they're up there. Yeah, Banco del Muteo Soccorso. Yeah, they're. I didn't know they were Italian, but I guess a name like that sounds pretty Italian. But yeah, it's interesting that Eastern European and European influence, especially, right? Because like you said, when I think of Prague, Italy does not come to mind. It's UK all the way.
Plus, the Italians were actually much more interesting in certain regards than the British, because there was a lot more art references, and these guys were actually very political. Half those bands were communists, when it was really dangerous to be a communist anywhere, but especially in Italy, where you had like a more right-wing government at that point. Mm-hmm. So like these guys were like actual rebel. Like Prague and Italy was actually the punk of the late 70s in Britain, in terms of where they stand. So that's actually, I always found that really interesting. And the music has aged relatively well, because these guys had like an amazing culture, musically speaking.
Well, that's it. It's a cultural thing. So for them in Italy, and if anyone that's been, obviously I've been a few times, it is normal for you to talk politics out of the blue and strike up a conversation. It is normal for you to socially smoke and explain and express your emotions, whether it's hand gestures or a high volume. That's the way it is. So for having a band like Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, well, yeah, if they're political, then they're getting the A+ vote in Italy. I can tell you one thing. Italy is one of those countries when it comes to music, even new wave stuff. Like, they're big on 50 Cent. They love 50 Cent. Eminem, they'll sell out like crazy, People you never would think that.
No.
But all those other bands that are big in the States, they go to Italy, they sell. Yeah. And they like Depeche Mode there too. Just thought I'd say that. Anyways, go on.
Interesting.
So also the other thing that allowed Prog to evolve was a few British record companies that had satellites everywhere in Europe, but these guys had a lot of money. It's one of those rare times where a label actually had money and wanted to share it with the artists. What a concept.
Yeah.
So you had labels like Charisma Records, Manticore Records, Vertigo Records, which was actually a satellite of Philips. And you had Virgin Records, which started in the 70s.
Hey, Sir Richard Branson.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's what he did.
He's awesome.
And back then, actually, he was really adventurous because he would sign people like Mike Oldfield. So people out there might not recognize the name, but you'll recognize the music the minute you hear it, because it's experimental, electronic, and progressive. But it was used in The Exorcist.
Yeah.
So that's the Tubular Bells is actually originally a long Prog album, which became a soundtrack.
That's right.
So that's the 70s for you, like experimental
Exorcist.
music that becomes popular music.
Prog music is related to The Exorcist, where there's a 11-year-old girl that could spin her head.
Exactly.
Sure, man.
All right, I'm in.
It's rock and roll.
She could, yeah, that was a crazy movie, by the way. That was just freaky.
Oh yeah.
Eh.
It wasn't Take a Date movie, no.
They did 3 of those, eh?
I don't know, really? I know they did 2.
It's not a take a date movie. Yeah,
No,
guaranteed.
you wouldn't.
No.
It'd be over. You may as well just take a cab home. Because people are projectile vomiting. I mean, it's not.
Well, you don't go down the stairs backwards like that?
No, only if I get really, really looped. Yeah.
So one of the things that happens also, so bands like Genesis and Emerson, Lake and Palmer's are really like huge in the 70s, and they inspire, with the help of the Italians actually, they inspire people in other countries like Germany and France to create something completely outside of what people considered actual music at that point. So there's this band in the 70s in France that became legend. It was called Magma, and it's a mix of rock, jazz, operatic vocals, and contemporary classical music. Again, they're like the Brits. These guys had a lot of musical education in school, but what makes them really unique is that they create their own language, which they call Zool or Zool for Ghostbusters fans.
Yeah, Zool, yeah.
And basically, it started in an international movement. There are Zool bands that are not French and that are not ex-members of Magma that are still out there today. But it just like the creativity in the 70s was just like off the wall crazy.
Like you could not pull this off today.
No, there's no money for it, actually.
You'd know, but also you'd be stomped as being pretentious.
Exactly.
You can't do that.
Well,
no way.
Although in the 70s, that's actually what killed it in the late 70s, early 80s.
Well,
people
yeah.
thought it was white people pretentious music.
There's a certain truth to that, in that the old joke used to be a lot of kind of freeform jazz was only enjoyed by jazz musicians who were into freeform jazz. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's only appreciated by people of a kind of a very narrow stratosphere, and they almost work themselves out of a job, prog rock. But we'll get to that, I'm sure. But there is a little bit of truth in that. The rejection of rock and roll probably went a little too far, you know.
Exactly. So something Kennedy mentioned earlier was the cover art. So cover art for prog was majorly important. And it's basically because these guys were fantasy and science fiction geeks before it was cool. And so you have like these bands like Yes, Gentle Giant, and Greenslade that have like colorful, dreamlike album covers. But you've got Emerson, Lake and Palmer that have this cover that's become a legend called Brain Salad Surgery. And it's actually made by H.R. Geiger, and you might not know the name, but you know the guy because he's the guy who designed the alien in the Aliens movie. So that phallic symbol-like alien, you can see it on a prog rock cover. So that's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, I remember the album. They had a few hits off that album too, believe it or not.
I'm still stuck on the Emerson, Lake and Palmer Christmas song. They did one. Yeah. They said there'll be snow at Christmas. They said there'll be peace on earth. I forget the name of it, but it's like, It was on a compilation album, and I saw Emerson, Lake, and
And
Palmer
Palmer.
did a.
They should have been stopped. Someone kicked the plug out.
Well, I guess when you need funds, Ian. That's,
Yeah, you got to pay a mortgage, I guess.
So basically, it's spread like in the late 70s. It starts dying out a little. Well, not dying out, but becoming a little less popular in the UK. But it starts spreading out in Canada, amongst other places. Actually, Quebec, and more specifically Montreal, is the entry point of prog in the 70s.
because of the Seaway, right? Like,
Well, amongst other things. But Quebec bands are really into it because it's a way for them to make music that English people will listen to, because most of it is instrumental. So you have
Interesting.
3 bands that most English Canadians don't know are Quebecers. It's FM, Harmonium, and Manège. Harmonium, I mean, most of their stuff is sung, but they do have instrumental stuff. Manège is purely instrumental, and FM is was very popular in the late 70s, early 80s. Most people just didn't know they were from Quebec.
They probably didn't knock the fact around too much, too.
Amongst other things, yeah. But it spread. It really did. You had bands from Austria, like Paternoster, Belgium, Brazil, Finland. You even have a Greek band with Aphrodite's Child. Although in that case, it almost looks like a bad joke with a name like that.
Lady Aphrodite.
Exactly. And of course, another place where it got really big was Japan, because there's always that old joke that I'm really big in Japan.
Yeah, I know.
But it was actually true for these guys, and they actually had Japanese prog bands, although they tended to be more like jazz, like Kenzo and Quasar and a few of them. But it even spread, like Kennedy told us, to Eastern European countries. So you had Poland, who had a few bands. You even have Romania that had a prog band in the 70s. And it got really big in Spain, but I think to a great extent, in the case of the Spanish, it was due to what they saw, what was happening in Italy. And they saw it as rebel music, and because they had been under a fascist dictator for the longest time. So Franco, and Franco was still alive at that point.
Oh, yeah.
So it was a really great way for them to give the middle finger to Franco, musically speaking.
well, it's interesting because you go down that list. You got Sweden, which has Dice, and then right to the States, Happy the Man, which I heard of. The one that threw me off, Kansas, that they're considered progressive rock.
It depends on the circle.
Borderline.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because they're deemed, any radio station,
Classic rock.
is deemed classic
Dust in the wind.
rock. Or Carry On My Wayward Son.
Yeah.
And they're a good band. There's no
yeah.
doubt about it. But to classify them as prog, wow, that's someone's taking a leap of faith.
Well, plus, like what Dr. Clark told us, there's the big influence of electronic instruments. So in the 70s, it's more like the technical gear than the Mellotron. So the early synthesizers become really big, and companies like Moog become legends in this time. And they're used and abused, actually, in a lot of the music of this era. So Keith Emerson apparently was hooked on Moog in a lot of his concerts. Rick Wakeman, Wakeman, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, even Genesis had a lot of these electronic instruments. And one of the big names in that era is Vangelis, which most people know as a soundtrack guy, but he's actually a prog guy from the 70s.
Greek, I think.
Yes, actually. And the arrival of this electronic music and a lot of the other stuff is actually the cause of the decadence in the late 70s. Because it becomes so experimental and becomes so narrow in terms of the interest, these bands start to break up. So you have Genesis, who became really the emblem of this time when they lost Peter Gabriel. People really thought, what's the point of Genesis going on if there's no Peter Gabriel? Well, that's when Phil Collins came in. But they lost within a few, I'm not sure if it's years or months, they lost Steve Hackett not too long after Peter Gabriel. And these guys were considered the soul of the band. And to a certain extent, they weren't people weren't off when they said that, because when these guys leave, it changes direction and Genesis becomes much more of a pop band.
Yeah, it's like when Mike McDonald joined Doobie Brothers. Suddenly, this weird force starts dominating the band and takes over until they leave. I know Collins hasn't left, but study the Doobie Brothers sometime. They're this kind of, I won't even call them folk rock, but suddenly Mike McDonald joins, and wow, off they go. And then he leaves, and they kind of go back to Old Black Water and all these songs they were doing before. It's very strange.
Yeah, but Genesis is still together?
Not officially. They never really broke up, but
Yeah.
they haven't really produced anything in 25 years.
Well, that's the thing, because Phil Collins pretty well, his solo career has been, phenomenal.
He's got a lot of health issues,
But losing Gabriel, because what did he do? He just took a sledgehammer to Salisbury Hill, and that was it.
Exactly. So yeah, and even bands that didn't necessarily break up, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they drifted towards melodic rock, which was really big. And they come out with something called Love Beach, which if you've ever seen the cover of,
it's so well known. It's classic.
Oh yeah,
that cover.
It's pure cheese.
It's so inappropriate. It's like an amateur photograph of three guys in too tight clothes on a beach in Jamaica. Like, you're not sure what the hell's going on, but it's not wholesome.
No, exactly. So yeah, so that's it. Basically, the 70s. As time goes, we're switching from classical music influenced progressive rock, like really much more complex melodic structures, to the Bee Gees style disco, which frankly killed, to a certain extent, the interest of a lot of people for this style. And like Dr. Clark told us, FM came in.
Yeah.
But as FM evolved, it became more commercial.
Yeah, good point.
Plus,
I think after a while, you know what? People just wanted to dance again. And by the late 70s, disco, Studio 54, whatever it was, the discotheques in Paris, you can't really dance to prog rock.
No.
You cannot dance to folk music. Now, so folk gave way to rock and roll. These things go through trends. And then disco went.
You could smoke dope to prog rock, right?
You sure could, but you couldn't dance to it. You could kind of writhe around the dust maybe, but you're not going to do hippie shake to it, no.
And the other thing also is that radio, because let's face it, music is always influenced by the mediums that come by. And unfortunately, late 70s, early 80s, it's something like Force of Evil that came in, which was called adult-oriented rock. Which was basically easy listening in the 50s. That's what came in under the banner of adult-oriented rock, which was basically easy listening rock.
So that's like the Michael Bolton of prog.
Yeah,
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, well, you kind of get this, we're not sure what's going on. Chicago was a band that I always thought was kind of, I don't know, maybe middle of the road. Or they never seemed.
You had an issue with Pete Cetera. That's your problem.
His haircut, yeah. I never really understood what the hell is going on with his
Why?
hair.
Because he has a big flock of blonde hair going.
I don't know. It was like he stole it from David Cassidy or something. I could never really do it, like a Keith Partridge cut. But
So come the late 70s, early 80s, so we have the radio-friendly groups. And this is what pisses off a lot of prog fans, like people like Styx, Asia, Foreigner, Toto, Journey, and even to a certain extent, the late stuff of Manfred Mann, Erd Band.
sure.
And actually, some people in the prog circles really hate Rush because
Only in Canada.
only in Canada, yeah. No, because they consider Rush traitors because the early stuff is very, very proggish. In the 80s, they become very commercial. And it's more or less true in the sense that they become a hit band in the 80s because they have radio-friendly stuff. The 90s, grunge actually comes in to bring them back to earth, to something less commercial. And they become a prog band again, like in the late 90s, early 2000s.
You know what, though? They are so loved in the States. I went on a holiday, as you guys know, talking to a lot of Americans at the pool, talking about music. Rush. As soon as you see you from Canada, oh, Rush. Yeah, okay, we got more than just Rush, man.
Sure do.
Like, but it's like they're obsessed with Rush. I don't get it. Like,
No, it totally is lost on me.
I don't like, okay, yeah, I appreciate what they did for Canadian music. They had it hard to get in there. I find the hip had a little bit more of an easier kind of journey because they got into the northern states. But like Rush, yeah, okay, dude, we got Neil Young, Crazy Horse, we got BTO, Guess Who,
Joni Mitchell, everybody.
Tom Cochran and Red Rider.
Yeah.
I'm just, I'm going on.
Life is a highway. You got one hit.
We got Nickelback.
Okay, Chad Croker. Now you've gone too far.
Wow,
Avril Lavigne.
Yeah.
I don't get Rush, but listeners in Radioland, you've heard me extemporize on Rush before. I don't get it, but I appreciate the musicianship, but I still don't understand it. I'll leave it at that.
This is Geddy Lee. You don't like him. He looks weird, right?
Well, no, hang on. It's just when I remember their albums and I remember their first album. It had kind of an exploding, if I remember this right, an exploding logo of Rush on it. And I couldn't handle it. I thought it was dreadful stuff. I never maybe that set my mind in the wrong way.
I like the one that has the dog standing next to the old school jukebox.
Oh, yeah.
Spirit of Radio, I think it is. And then they have one with nuts and bolts on it.
Oh, yeah. That's a famous one, yeah.
So, yeah, like I said, artwork.
Yep.
It's the best. Wish you were here. Wouldn't you want to shake someone's hand and have them burn while you're doing it?
Oh, every day.
Here you go.
Every single day.
If it burns, let someone know.
Burn, baby, burn.
So basically, when we get to the 80s, late 80s, that's when there's a comeback to a certain extent. So it's not from the big bands, though. And these guys, basically, because the term prog rock has become so synonymous with, well, I wouldn't say trash, but the term itself has become almost poison. So these guys come up with the name neo-prog. And it's actually, ironically, guys from the UK that come in and become very influential. So you probably heard the name Marillion. And they sound like early Genesis, basically, in the late 80s. There's other bands like IQ, Palace, 12th Night, which couldn't be a more English name for a band, really, when you think about it. Clive Nolan, Mind Games, like a bunch of these guys. But the other big force in neo-prog is Japan. Because Japan, from the late 60s to the early 80s, they're a huge importer of music. Mostly because their industry was completely destroyed by the Americans. But come the 80s, and they have a lot of money, they have a lot of power and a lot of influence. There are bands like Outer Limits and Vermilion Sands that come out of Japan, and they just dominate these circles of neo-prog guys. And they bring back a lot of the fun in it. So these guys are very visible. They have beautiful color covers. Extensive information about the history of their bands, which was the other thing about prog in the 70s. Like, you had covers that had like a novel word of text in them, which some people actually put into the column, oh yeah, they're just trying to bust our ball and showing off. Other people just got into it, and it was almost like a musical course on your cover, which you read while you were smoking a joint.
Yeah, that was it. It went. I remember the people thought the Beatles' White Album was pretentious in '68 because they could just put out a totally white album, and with not even the. I think it was on the spine. The Beatles, like, talk about, yeah, we can do it, you can't. Okay, and that's one of the reasons I think they might have done that.
Well, that's where Weezer got all their red album, blue album, teal album, black album. Then they have other ones, Picton or Pickington or something with the Beverly Hills one, and then Pacifica is another one.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny because they did all the colors, right?
May as well. If someone does white, you do teal.
They did teal. That's their throwback where they did all remakes.
You're being ironic, yeah.
Yeah, I am. Don't you think?
And the other thing that happens in the 80s, for those of you old enough to remember, is the arrival of the CD. So prog being a type of music that's always been influenced by a medium, all of a sudden you go from a record which could hold, if you wanted quality sound, was about 30 minutes for a two-faced record. If you really wanted a good sound,
you might be able to squeeze 40 minutes. Yeah, maybe.
So arrives the CD. It's 80
yeah.
minutes without even trying on one.
Yeah.
So you have these bands that can actually try to do some stuff that's completely insane. Two CDs worth of music, which clocks in at about almost 3 hours. And so like bands like Exposure come in, and one of the names that's synonymous now with prog rock, which is Steven Wilson, who basically in the 80s was like a everyday kind of musician in terms of he helped a lot of bands. He would then go on to be the founder of Porcupine 3, which was really big in the 90s. And nowadays, the reason why his name's really big in prog circle is he's basically remastering all the classics. Prog starts becoming a genre that's interested in certain circles outside. Again, Spain comes back. Italy, to a certain extent, not as much as in the 70s. And then it goes up north. Sweden starts getting a lot more bands. The Netherlands. Germany, again, some interest in it, but at that point, Germany is more into industrial music, which basically sounds like you're dropping 2-ton beam into a construction site, and that's basically what it is in terms of sound.
Is that Rammstein now? They're considered prog?
I think, it's just bizarre. I think prog is one of those categories which, after 20 years, everybody gets declared prog to a certain extent.
Rammstein there, whatever I couldn't understand a bloody word they're saying.
Kraftwerk was always big.
I'm not big on my German linguistics, but I couldn't understand anything. But, growing up in the 90s, early zeros, that's what they call it. They were big, man. This thing, they were coming in huge.
Actually, I think they're one of the first bands where the internet plays a really big part in it.
Sure. Yeah.
Because you can really find them in your record store, but you could find them on the internet really easily.
Well, they're touring, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So comes the 90s, and it's in certain circles, it's called the third generation. So basically, these guys learned from all the excess from the late 70s and the really shitty music from the 80s. And they decide to create what they call the new wave of progressive rock bands. So they have names like Ozric Tentacles. They have bands in Sweden like the Flower Kings. You got Big Train in the UK. You got Spock's Beard in the USA. Iluvatar in the USA again. Kenzo in Japan. And what these guys are more... I don't know how to really qualify what they do. It's they take the complexity of previous styles, but they keep the idea that it should be approachable. And actually, this is where it starts to create this really big confusion, which Kennedy mentioned, which is this subcategory called prog metal. So... in the 70s and the 80s, metal was really easy to spot. Like, you have Black Sabbath and you have, like, these early bands that have a really distinct sound.
Yeah.
And then metal goes through their prog moment, if we can call it that. And heavy metal becomes extraordinarily complex. It has huge symphonic orchestras going into it. And especially if you go to Sweden, you have a ton of prog metal bands, and they are borderline modernist classical music, just with a really big rhythm and a guy screaming over it. So it's a really bizarre phenomenon, and I think to a certain extent it's the darkness of the 90s, like what grunge brought in. You couldn't be too light anymore.
Maybe.
So that's the 90s, and in the 2000s, we've got basically, like in every other genre in the early 2000s, it's bands that are consolidating their position and their power. So you've got Transatlantic in Europe, Spock's Beard in the USA, Porcupine 3 in the UK, and they become basically the reference. There are other groups, but it's basically we're back to like mega bands that are sucking all the oxygen in the room, and you don't really hear about a lot of other bands. We get a few one-hit wonders, nothing much. And like we mentioned during the show, the other phenomenon in the last 10 years is what we could call prog rock revisionism, which is basically trying to put anybody and everybody in a progressive rock category. You've got progressive metal, you've got progressive jazz, you've got, like I said, there are battles right now in circles to say, is Rush miscategorized as a prog band? I think most people that listen to it would call it prog.
I think so. I'm not going to take them out of that category. They don't belong in rock.
Yeah, I mean,
let them go in prog.
Yeah, it's more difficult. I'll just use the term difficult music. When I think of Rush, strange time signatures, very good musicianship. Mm-hmm. Usually rock and roll, I mean, what was the old thing? 3 chords and an attitude or something? Like, you don't need... Rock and roll is quite different. It's not complex music, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, you think of Gene Vincent or the early guys, and you take it up into, I don't know, Bruce Springsteen or something. It's not complex. It's just very kind of working class, blue collar themes. And prog rock, one thing we could also add, was the first people, I think, that I witnessed to put on a show. The first time I ever saw dry ice, billows of it, was a Pink Floyd concert in the 70s.
Umaguma?
Yeah, Umagama. But and they had light shows, and when lasers came in, I know everyone out there in Radioland's used to laser beams at rock shows, but when they first came in, everyone thought you could go blind if it hit you. But they were the first guys, and Electric Light Orchestra, I wouldn't actually call them prog, but when they in the 70s, they brought out the smoke machines. They had everything going, smoke bombs, lasers. And rock and roll guys tended not to do that. You know, they got dragged. People like The Who got dragged into it, but because of them from the 60s, these guys didn't do it. You know, they weren't. McCartney, Lennon, all the Beatles that went on, Harrison, they never did it either. They weren't comfortable with it. Like putting on a show. Whereas guys like Elton John, who's not really prog rock, but they put on a show, and they have all the stuff borrowed from prog, like the smoke bombs and everything else.
I'm going to sign off. Ferris Kennedy.
Ian Clark.
Stephen Wheeler.
Have a good night.
Shine on.